Why this nation's greatest victory became its greatest burden. It was celebrated as a triumph that defined a generation. Flags rose, enemies retreated, and history marked the moment as a turning point. But victory can carry weight long after the celebration ends. This story matters today because success is often treated as an ending, when in reality it can become a responsibility that reshapes a nation's future in unexpected ways. What feels like resolution can quietly become obligation. The moment of triumph is preserved in memory as the climax of the story, but in truth, it is the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the struggle to win, but by the far more complex struggle to live with what winning demands. At the moment of victory, the nation stood unified, confident, and widely admired. Sacrifice had paid off, survival was secured, and the world recognized its strength and resilience. What few considered was how winning would change expectations. Power brings responsibility, influence invites scrutiny, and success demands maintenance. The world did not simply admire the victory and move on. It expected the nation to act according to the position that victory had created. And those expectations came without the resources, patience, or understanding needed to fulfill them. Allies began to rely on the nation's leadership, while rivals watched closely, recalibrating strategies in response to its new position. The victory shifted balance, turning defense into authority. What had been a fight for survival was now interpreted as a claim to regional or global leadership. And with that interpretation came obligations a nation had never sought and was not fully prepared to carry. The transition from defender to leader happened in perception of others before it was acknowledged at home, and by the time the nation recognized its new role, the expectations attached to it were already shaping international relations in ways that could not easily be reversed. At home, institutions expanded to manage new responsibilities, resources were redirected, and priorities adjusted to sustain what had been achieved. The machinery of governance, built for crisis, now had to be repurposed for stewardship, a transition that proved far more difficult than the original mobilization. At first, these changes felt natural, even deserved. Victory justified effort, cost, and ambition. But over time, the burden grew heavier, as maintaining success proved more complex than achieving it. This was the beginning of a new challenge, not survival, but stewardship of victory itself. As the years passed, the demands created by victory began to shape policy more than choice, as maintaining status required constant attention, resources, and restraint. Security commitments expanded, drawing the nation into responsibilities far beyond its original goals, while retreat increasingly looked like weakness. Alliances that had been formed in the urgency of conflict became permanent obligations, and each one carried expectations of support, investment, and military readiness that consumed resources originally intended for domestic development. Economic priorities shifted to sustain influence, tying prosperity to stability in regions now linked to the nation's success. The economy was reorganized around the demands of maintaining a position that victory had established, and this reorganization diverted attention from internal needs that grew more pressing with each passing year. At home, public expectations rose, assuming continued leadership without fully accounting for cost or risk. Citizens who had celebrated victory expected its benefits to continue indefinitely, and political leaders found it easier to maintain commitments than to explain why reducing them might be necessary. Institutions grew more complex, tasked with managing outcomes that victory had made permanent rather than temporary. Bureaucracies expanded, defense budgets grew, and diplomatic obligations multiplied, each one justified by the position the nation now occupied, and each one contributing to the weight that victory had placed on national resources. What once felt empowering slowly became obligatory, as success narrowed options instead of expanding them. The nation discovered that the most difficult aspect of victory was not winning, but the loss of freedom that came with having won. Retreat from any commitment was interpreted as decline, and maintaining all commitments demanded sacrifices that were increasingly difficult to justify to a population that had expected peace, not permanent mobilization. The nation was no longer free to act only for itself, because its victory had made it essential to others, and that dependence would soon test the limits of triumph. The conflict emerged when the weight of responsibility began to strain the nation's capacity, exposing the tension between maintaining leadership and preserving internal stability. The balance that had seemed sustainable in the years immediately following victory became untenable as time passed and conditions changed. Foreign commitments pulled resources outward, while domestic needs demanded attention at home, creating competition rather than balance. Infrastructure deteriorated. Social services were underfunded. Economic inequality widened as the benefits of the nation's global position were distributed unevenly among its citizens. The cost of maintaining external commitments was being paid primarily by those who benefited from them least. Public debate intensified as citizens questioned whether the victory they celebrated had committed them to endless obligation. A new generation, born after the triumph, struggled to understand why sacrifices were still being demanded for a victory they had not experienced and a threat they could no longer see. The emotional connection to the original conflict had faded, but the obligations it had created remained in full force, and justifying those obligations to people who had no memory of the crisis that produced them became increasingly difficult. Allies expected consistency, while rivals tested limits, sensing fatigue beneath confidence. The nation found itself trapped in a position where reducing commitments would be interpreted as weakness by adversaries and abandonment by partners, while maintaining them required resources that were no longer available without domestic cost. Every choice carried consequences, and all the consequences were painful. The buildup reached its peak when a major crisis forced a nation to choose between preserving its image and protecting its long-term resilience. The crisis demanded a response, but the response required resources that had already been stretched to their limits. And for the first time, the nation had confronted the possibility that victory had committed it to more than it could sustain. What had once unified society now divided it, as the cost of victory became visible and contested. Debates that had been deferred by patriotism and pride could no longer be avoided, and the divisions they revealed were deeper than anyone had expected. Some argued that the commitments must be maintained at any cost, that abandoning them would dishonor the sacrifices that had produced victory. Others argued that the nation owed its first obligation to its own citizens, and that external commitments that came at the expense of domestic well-being were unsustainable regardless of their origins. Success had delivered security, but it had also locked the nation into a role it could not easily escape. This was the moment when triumph began to feel like a burden rather than an achievement, and the price of victory demanded a reckoning. The climax arrived when the nation finally confronted the reality that its greatest victory had reshaped not only its power, but its freedom. What once felt like triumph now demanded constant sacrifice to sustain. The celebration had ended decades earlier, but the obligations continued and would continue as far into the future as anyone could see. The resolution lies in recognizing that success changes the terms of choice, turning achievement into responsibility that must be managed, not celebrated endlessly. Victory is not an endpoint, but a new beginning with its own risks. The nation learned that winning does not grant permanent safety. It grants a new set of obligations, and the wisdom to manage those obligations determines whether victory becomes a foundation or a prison. Some victories create more freedom, others create less. Understanding which kind has been won requires honesty about costs, benefits, and alternatives. This story matters today because many societies continue to chase success without preparing for the obligations it creates. History reminds us that winning reshapes identity, expectation, and limitation all at once. Every victory writes a new chapter, and that chapter is often harder to navigate than the one that preceded it. The skills that produce victory are not the same as the skills that manage its aftermath. True strength is not only the ability to achieve victory, but the wisdom to live with its consequences. And that wisdom is rarely present at the moment of triumph, when celebration makes reflection feel unnecessary. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Why